Once again, I would love to talk in great detail about all the things that are involved in this haunting, but because it's the double, I do have to boil it down to be as concise as possible. So here is the concise version of the history of the Mackenzie poltergeist. In 1603, Elizabeth I of England did the very first useful thing in her long life and died. Even better, Queen Elizabeth left no heir, and the King of Scots inherited the throne of England. Now, the King of Scots was a very different thing to the King of England. King of Scots, because with the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, the people of this land made it clear that the crown of Scotland didn't come from the land you owned, and it didn't come from God. It came from us. We introduced a phrase in the Declaration of Arbroath, the community of the realm, meaning the people. The crown of this country comes from the people of Scotland. We gave it to Robert the Bruce, that he would use it to defend our freedom. And the Declaration makes it clear that if any king fails to use that crown in accordance with that tradition, the crown is forfeit. We take it back. We give it to someone who will defend our freedom. The King of England was very different. The King of England was, according to their traditions, divinely appointed by God to do his will. And more than being King of England, as the King of England, he was also the supreme leader of the Church of England. Now, the Church of England was an Episcopalian setup. This is basically a reformed version of the Catholic Church, where the king replaces the Pope as the head, and you still had bishops and priests and all sorts of fancy stuff. Scotland, however, was Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians believed that putting kings, popes and bishops between us and God was the wrong thing to do. The Presbyterians teach that all souls can communicate equally with God, whether they're a king or a beggar. And these middlemen simply got in the way of the communication. All souls were equal. All prayers were answered equally. And to sum this up, we decided to come up with another written document defining our position in relation to our religion and the United Kingdom. King James VI and I of Great Britain was a very charismatic man, and a lot of the disagreements that would have come into violence were kept at bay by his good personality. But his son, Charles I, had very little personality. He didn't care about Scotland, and he ordered us to convert to Episcopalianism. So in this churchyard, we drew up a reply, the National Covenant. In 1638, this document was drawn up, signed by many in their own blood, and what it told our king was that what this new United Kingdom needed was a democratically representative government, a democratically representative church, and a democratic union between crown, government, church, and the people, who would agree to be governed by him in return for one thing: the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religious practice for all citizens. We invented the modern democracy, right here. But of course they didn't call it democracy, they called it treason. The king was outraged. He ordered a bloody suppression of the covenant, and this suppression dragged the whole of the United Kingdom into civil war that would cost Charles I his head. It would then bring on the revolution of Cromwell, the military occupation of Scotland, enforced religious tolerance, and then the Restoration. Charles II. With the Restoration, the parliaments of Great Britain all decided to basically tear out the last 30 years of history and just pretend Charles II was Charles I and everything was fine, which meant the persecution began again. And the man who led the persecution here in Charles II's reign was George Mackenzie, the King's Advocate. As Chief Judge of Edinburgh, George Mackenzie sentenced no less than 18,000 Covenanters to their deaths. And that's reason enough for a man to get a nickname like Bloody. But Bloody George Mackenzie's nickname comes from a later event, the last great battle of the Covenanter age, Bothwell Brig. A group of Covenanters were defending a bridge. The king's armies were sent out to rout them. Quarter was to be given to any man who surrendered. George Mackenzie declined to pass that part of the orders on. He told his men no quarter was to be given. So, as a brave small group of Covenanters defended the bridge, the rest of the Covenanters argued amongst themselves about whether they should fight or run. By the time they'd finished arguing and deciding what to do, the battle was lost. The 400 men defending the bridge had been slaughtered, and as the rest of the army of the Covenanters tried to disperse, they were captured. 1,200 men were bound in chains and marched barefoot from Stirling to Edinburgh over 3 nights with no food or shelter provided. When they got here, 16 were publicly tortured to death, and the remaining men, 1,184, were taken in here. And on the other side of this quiet little iron gate, in 1679, Scotland answered the invention of the modern democracy by inventing the concentration camp. 1,184 men were stripped naked and forced to lie face down in the mud from July until December. 2 ounces of bread were given to each man each day to stop them starving to death. That didn't work. 257 of them starved to death. Snipers were positioned around the walls, and if anyone moved or spoke, they could be shot on the spot. Although they did tend to bring them out here, line them up and shoot them. And although the graveyard's crumbling and bricks have to be replaced, 1 or 2 bullet holes remain from this time. 156 men were shot. 287 died of exposure to the elements. 300 bought their way out or escaped under cover of darkness. But after 6 months and 600 deaths, there were 260 still in there, bloodied, unbowed, and far too dangerous to be let go. But Scotland's conscience was creaking, and Charles II realised this had started one civil war, it could start another. He wanted this business finished. He ordered Mackenzie to deport the survivors to Barbados, but Mackenzie didn't agree. He had the men deported to the middle of the North Sea, and off the coast of Orkney in fine weather, the crew chained the prison cabin shut and sank the ships. 40 men survived. Having destroyed the Covenanters and sentenced now 19,000 men to their deaths, Mackenzie passed peacefully in his sleep in 1691 and insisted that he should be buried just there, in the big acorn-topped, rounded mausoleum. If you can't see that, don't worry, we'll get a better look at it shortly as we pass out. But this tomb is the tallest in the graveyard. It's got 3 floors. It's the biggest in the graveyard. It's the most expensive in the graveyard. And it's built just there because George wanted it to stand as near as was possible to the Covenanters' prison, which is pretty bad feng shui. From the day of his death, the people of Edinburgh told that this man was so wicked that God would never allow him to find his eternal rest. And the stories of the haunting of George Mackenzie begin immediately, attacking children for 100 years, attacking women for 100 years, and then moving to Mackenzie's house, which was directly above the vaults, and from the vaults into the vaults of the South Bridge, moving across the structure throughout 300 years of history until 1999. In 1999, that old tomb was desecrated, and following that, this place became dangerous. People began to be attacked, and it got so bad that one of them tried to sue the council. The council locked the gates. We've been the only people going in since then. Before we do go in, a couple of things. First and foremost, yet again, if anybody is overwhelmed by the desire to prod anybody else and go, boo! Do it on this side of the gates. If you do it on the other side of the gates, I will not have a sense of humour about it. Second, if anything happens to us in here that cannot be explained by conventional science, it will be treated in a court of law, if you take it that far, as a psychosomatic event. This means you imagined it so very hard, you made it happen. I tell you this not to discourage anyone from taking legal action, it's good publicity, but I want to be very honest with you about your chances. 18 people have taken us to court, and the courts are still laughing. If you trip over something that I should have warned you about, I am responsible for your safety. If something invisible springs out the blackness and takes your head clean off your shoulders, I am not. I am not guaranteeing your safety. I am telling you, we've had 3,800 people bitten, burned, scratched, slashed, bashed, bruised, or otherwise injured in here, 458 knocked out, and there have been 2 deaths associated with this haunting. If you join us through this gate, you do so at your own risk and of your own volition. Verbal contract, binding condition of entry. Don't agree, can't come in. Come in, you've agreed. Any questions? Perfect. Once we are inside, I need to lock the gate behind us. The graveyard is open to the public, and we do get 1 or 2 lovely homeless gentlemen, one called Robert, who is particularly fond of following us in and going, "I'm the poltergeist!" I'd really rather he didn't, so I'm going to lock the gate. If anything happens to me, the key's in this pocket of my jacket. I'm faking it. Get them, get out. Smallest key in the chain. Oh, second smallest key in the chain. The round small key. When we do go in here, in or around the trees, I recommend you stick to the centre of the path. you'll see where the worn path goes to, and then it goes back to grass. Don't go any further than the worn path.